enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, you can make lovely bluebird's eggs with black spots on them, and when you put one of these in your mouth, they gradually get smaller and smaller until suddenly there is nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it, he said. Mine too, said little Charlie. But please go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door listening. Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince, said Grandma Josephine. He'd like to hear that one. You mean Prince Pondicherry, said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Completely nutty, said Grandpa George. But very rich, said Grandma Georgina. What did he do? Asked Charlie eagerly. Listen, said Grandpa Joe, and I'll tell you. Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka, said Grandpa Joe, and asked him to come all the way to England to build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. Did Mr. Wonka do it? He did indeed. And what a palace it was! It had 100 rooms, and everything was made of either dark or light chocolate. The bricks were chocolate, and the cement holding them together was chocolate, and the windows were chocolate, and the walls and the ceilings were made of chocolate. So were the carpets and the pictures and the furniture and the beds. And when you turned on the taps in the bathroom, chocolate came right out. When it was all finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pondicherry, I warn you though, it won't last very long, so you'd better start eating it right away. Nonsense, shouted the prince. I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to nibble the staircase or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it. But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because soon after this, there came a very hot day with a boiling sun, and the whole palace began to melt. And then it sank slowly to the ground, and the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke up to find himself swimming around in a huge, brown, sticky lake of chocolate. Little Charlie sat very still on the edge of the bed, staring at his grandfather. Charlie's face was bright, and his eyes were stretched so wide you could see the whites all around. Is all this really true? He asked. Are you pulling my leg? It's true! Cried all four of the old people at once. Of course it's true! Ask anyone you like. And I'll tell you something else that's true, said Grandpa Joe. And now he leaned closer to Charlie and lowered his voice to a soft, secret whisper. Nobody ever comes out. Out of where? Asked Charlie. And nobody ever goes in. In where? Cried Charlie. Wonka's factory, of course. Grandpa, what do you mean? I mean workers, Charlie. Workers? All factories, said Grandpa, have workers streaming in and out of the gates in the mornings and the evenings. Except yours. Have you ever seen a single person going into that place or coming out? Little Charlie looked slowly around at each of the four faces, one after the other, and they all looked back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. There's no sign of joking or leg pulling on any of them. But have you? Asked Grandpa Joe. I really don't know, Grandpa, Charlie said. Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed. Exactly, said Grandpa Joe. But there must be people working there. Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people, anyway. Then who? Cried Charlie. That's it, you see. That's another of Mr. Willy Wonka's clevernesses. Charlie, dear, Mrs. Bucket called her out from where she was standing by the door. It's time for bed. That's enough for tonight. But, Mother, I must hear. Tomorrow, darling. That's right, said Grandpa. I'll tell you the rest of it tomorrow.
Give presents or certificates to the best readers from last semester. They have done very well. They've done free voluntary reading, and as I said in most of my classes, reading is very good, enjoyable. It can also make your English better.
Charlie is a little boy who lives with his 4 grandparents and his mom and dad. And the grandparents stay in bed all day. They never move. And they're all very, very poor. And they live next to a chocolate factory. And the owner of the chocolate factory is Willy Wonka. And the chocolate factory is very amazing. And in this section, Grandpa Joe is telling Charlie about the chocolate factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up, and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. For they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often, Charlie's mother and father would come in as well, and stand by the door listening to the stories that the old people told. And thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and bored. One evening when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?"
True!
Cried all 4 of them at once.
Of course it's true! Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other. And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?
"My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that."
Well, I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was clever. Clever! Cried the old man. He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?
The The other three old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, absolutely true. Just as true as it can be. And Grandpa said, you mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory? Never, answered little Charlie. Good heavens, I don't know what's the matter. Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please? I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully. Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the four grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. What a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka, cried Grandpa Joe. Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and far creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make? Perfectly true, cried Grandma Josephine. And he sends them to all the four corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe? It is, my dear, it is. And to all the kings and presidents of the world as well. Isn't only candy bars he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve, Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the icebox? You can leave it in the sun all morning on a hot day. It won't go red. But that's impossible, said little Charlie, staring at his grandfather. Of course it's impossible, cried Grandpa Joe. It's completely absurd. But Willy Wonka has done it! Quite right, the others agreed, nodding their heads. Mr. Wonka has done it. And then, again, Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly now, so that Charlie would have to say words. Mr. Willy Wonka made marshmallows that tasted fabulous, and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little filling sweets that melted deliciously belonging to perfect between your lips. You can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and candy balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, you can make lovely bluebird's eggs with black spots on them. And when you put one of these in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there's nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it, he said. Mine too, said little Charlie, but please go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door listening. Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince, said Grandma Josephine. He'd like to hear that. You mean Prince Pondicherry, said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Completely shocking, oh, said Grandpa George. But very rich, said Grandma Georgina. What did he read? Asked Charlie eagerly. Listen, said Grandpa Joe, and I'll tell you.